Hello, everyone. This is Elias Fontenot, and you are listening to the Great Figures of History podcast. I'm going to be restarting this specific podcast on Augustus. Uh, I'm already doing it. I'm going to try to stop and keep my U's from coming out too much. That's the main reason why I'm redoing it. Um, so essentially, there's going to be three parts to it. Because the way I look at it, Augustus is such a big figure, and so much has been done on him, biographies, you know, etc. There's so much material on him, and a lot of it is, just on Augustus. It's like only on his life, and I feel like to really understand him, he doesn't really make sense in isolation, just looking at just his story, because like when you really look at the story of Augustus, it's the story of Rome. And he's the product of a century of instability before him. Like, he didn't start any of that. He was just the ender, the guy who ended it. Um, so that's what I'm going to be telling. I'm going to be telling the story of that century because that is what Augustus is. He's the product of a country that was tearing itself apart. And the men that I'm going to be doing these podcasts on, the two preceding podcasts, the first one's going to be on Marius and Sulla. The second one's going to be on Julius Caesar. And the reason why is I feel like you can't understand Augustus without understanding them first. They're the stepping stones that explain why Rome was ready to accept a dictator, to accept an emperor. So, yeah, without further ado, let us start the first episode in the podcast of Augustus. And yeah, it will be on Marius and Sulla. And it will be titled When Romans Learned to Kill Rome. Episode 1, When Romans Learned to Kill Rome. By the 2nd century before Christ, Rome had done what no city-state was ever meant to do. It had conquered the Mediterranean. Carthage, the great commercial empire of the Western Sea, which was a trading post originally for the Phoenicians and eventually grew into being a rival power to Rome, they were destroyed. They were gone. Its fleets were burned, its walls torn down, its land had been turned into a Roman province. In the east, the ancient kingdoms of Greece and Macedonia had been shattered. The heirs of Alexander now bowed, negotiated, or disappeared entirely. From Spain to Anatolia, from North Africa to southern Gaul, Rome was no longer just a republic. It was a hegemon. And yet at its center, Rome still governed itself as if it were a small Italian city-state. Very similar to America today. We won World War II. We now have the benefits essentially of an empire. We control Japan. We control Germany. We influence most of the nations of the world. And yet we still try to govern ourselves as a small country. So I think that there's a comparison that could be made there. So yeah, Rome was a hegemon, but yet at its center, Rome still acted like it was, this small little Italian city-state. And so there was no bureaucracy to rule an empire, no standing professional army paid by the state, no long-term executive power to match Rome's global reach. Provinces were handed to governors for a year at a time. Men who arrived poor and left rich. So essentially, let's say I was a governor of Greece. I only get 1 year to govern Greece. I arrived there. I'm poor. I'm like, dang, I just became governor of Greece. I should use this to my advantage. So I only got a year before another guy comes up in here. So let me just extort all of my citizens. And so what this led to is, because there's only 1 year, uh, 1 year, that you're leading, each year, uh, would be another guy who did the same thing as the last guy, which is just extort the citizens and not really do its job. So they were governors, but they didn't really do their job well. Um, so provinces were handed to governors for a year at a time, men who often arrived poor and left rich. Armies were raised for emergencies and disbanded in theory, even as wars became permanent. So I think that this is another thing we need to zero in on here, is that up until this point, so just to be clear, where we're at in Roman times right now is right before Marius. And the reason why that's important to bring up is because at that time Rome did not have a professional army. It did not have a standing army. So essentially what it would do is, if it went to war with someone, it would raise all of its citizens. Most of the time it would be the wealthier citizens, because they could afford to own a horse, they could afford to own armor or sword or whatever, and they would raise the army and then go attack and then come back. So there wasn't a army always training, like there will be later. I just want to make sure that that's understood. Victory brought unimaginable wealth: gold, slaves, land, but it also brought inequality on a scale Rome had never known. Greek culture flooded the city. Eastern luxuries reshaped Roman tastes. Senators debated philosophy while masses of displaced farmers crowded into Rome, dependent on grain and patronage to survive. The Republic had won the world, but it had lost control of itself. Power flowed outward, to generals commanding legions for years on end, fighting far from Rome, making life and death decisions without oversight. Soldiers began to look to their commanders, not the Senate, for pay, land, and honor. The old civic army of citizen farmers was quietly disappearing. And into this overstretched, overconfident, and deeply unequal empire stepped a man from the countryside, unknown, unfashionable, and underestimated: Gaius Marius. He would rise by breaking traditions that no longer matched Rome's reality. He would reshape the army to fit an empire, not a republic. And in doing so, he would teach Rome a lesson it could never unlearn: that power, once taken, does not return easily. Gaius Marius came from an equestrian family that held local prominence but little influence in Rome. Although later traditions sometimes portrayed him as a man of humble origins, his family likely possessed substantial land holdings, providing the wealth necessary to pursue a public career. Even so, Marius's early path was marked by resistance. As a novus homo, a new man without consular ancestors, so without an ancestor who was a consul, a great man, essentially. He's the first person in his family. He's starting his family, if that makes sense. So he's a new man, doesn't have ancestors. So without consular ancestors, he faced the entrenched barriers of a political system designed to preserve elite dominance. His election as tribune of the plebs in 119 BC marked his first major breakthrough. In that office, Marius sponsored reforms aimed at limiting aristocratic interference in elections, signaling a populist approach that challenged senatorial authority. Advancing to the praetorship in 115 BC, he governed Hispania Ulterior, which is Spain, by the way. Hispania is Latin for Spain. So he governed Spain, where his tenure was competent, if unspectacular, consisting mainly of small campaigns against local bandits. More consequential than his Spanish service, however, this is the part that ties everything in, where, he ties into Augustus and everything, was his marriage to Julia of the patrician Julii family. This alliance strengthened his social standing and linked him to one of Rome's most ancient lineages, a connection that would later gain historic significance through Julius' nephew, Gaius Julius Caesar, and he gets the Gaius from Gaius Marius. By the late 2nd century BC, Roman politics had split into two rival approaches, the Optimates and the Populares. The Optimates represented the Senate and the aristocracy, defending tradition, hierarchy, and their hold on power. Any reform to them was a threat to stability in their eyes. The Populares, on the other hand, appealed directly to the people. Urban plebs, dispossessed farmers, and newly enfranchised Italians. Using the popular assemblies and the tribunate to bypass the Senate, they weren't pushing democracy as we know it, but they tapped into growing resentment against elite power. This tension had deep roots. Long wars had devastated small farmers, while wealthy aristocrats grew richer, consolidating land into massive estates and filling the cities with dependent poor. The violent deaths of the Gracchi brothers a century earlier showed that politics could be deadly, and compromise was becoming impossible. Into this divided, tense environment stepped Gaius Marius. Not strictly a populist, he nothing less understood the power of the people. To the Senate, he was an upstart, bypassing tradition. To the masses, he was proof that Rome's rigid order could be challenged. What neither side realized was that this struggle was no longer just political. As generals like Marius rose through popular support and military success, power began to shift from institutions like the Senate and the People's Assembly to men like Marius and Sulla, Julius Caesar, and the Republic would never be the same as a result. In 107 BC, Gaius Marius reached a turning point in his career. He was elected consul for the first time. The stage was set by Rome's growing frustration with its aristocratic generals, whose incompetence and corruption during the Jurgentine War had become a national embarrassment. Marius seized the moment, presenting himself as a man of action and ability, a practical choice in a time of crisis. Thus, he was elected consul and sent to lead the war in Numidia. Once in Numidia, Marius faced a new challenge: the Roman army itself. For decades, recruitment had been limited to citizens with property, leaving Rome short-handed for extended campaigns abroad. Marius broke with tradition, opening enlistment to the capitae censae, the poorest citizens of Rome, men with nothing to lose but everything to gain. He promised them pay, equipment, and the chance for land upon retirement. This not only swelled the ranks, but created a force fiercely loyal to him personally and him alone, laying the groundwork for a new model of Roman military power. Marius's campaign was swift and decisive, using innovative tactics and careful planning. He cornered and captured Jugurtha, the cunning Numidian king who had long eluded Rome's grasp. The victory was more than a military achievement. It was a political statement. When Marius returned to Rome in triumph, he paraded Jugurtha through the streets, showcasing Rome's restored honor and his own rising star. But there was more beneath the surface. By relying on property-less citizens and cultivating personal loyalty, Marius subtly challenged the old order. The Senate, accustomed to controlling armies and generals, saw a new power emerging, one built on personal ambition, popular support, and military might. His victory in Numidia made him a hero to the people, a threat to the elite, and a man whose influence would shape the next decades of Roman politics. After his triumph in Numidia, Marius did something almost unprecedented. He returned to the consulship multiple times, eventually holding it 7 times, a feat unheard of in Roman tradition. Rome's political norms, which dictated annual rotation and limits on repeated office holding, were bending under the weight of crisis and under Marius's ambition. So look at Marius as kind of like FDR, right? Like in America, there was a there wasn't a law stating that you couldn't run more than twice before FDR. It was more of a tradition. And so during World War II, we needed that continuance of command, that continuance of leadership. So FDR was elected 4 consecutive times from 1933, I think his first term was, to 1945, which has never been done before him or since. And after FDR, we actually passed a law in America saying that a president can only be elected twice. So that is kind of a good comparison for Marius. He got that first consulship, and then he didn't stop until he held it 7 times. And a couple, I think 4 of those were consecutive years in a row that he held it. So it just shows kind of like the crisis that Rome is under at the time, and also, how ambitious Marius is. So after his triumph in Numidia, the next major threat came from the north, the Cimbri and the Teutons, massive Germanic tribes moving south into Roman territory. These armies were not only numerous, but highly mobile, terrifying the Italian countryside and threatening the Republic itself. Rome's previous generals had failed to stop them, creating panic in the Senate and among the people. Marius, however, approached the challenge differently. Building on his Jugurthine War experience, he reorganized the army completely. His reforms, often called the Marian reforms, transformed Rome's military. It made it so that there's open recruitment to all citizens, including the landless, giving Rome access to far more manpower. Remember before I said that only people who could afford it, like if you owned a horse, if you owned armor, then you could join the army. He made it to where recruitment for everybody. We'll give you a sword, we'll give you armor, just come join. Standardized training and equipment. So soldiers were uniformly prepared for battle rather than relying on personal wealth. Going back to what I just said, because you're recruiting everyone, not just the people who can afford it, now Rome is taking, the check for the equipment and everything. The personal soldier doesn't have to worry about it. He just has to show up, he'll get given a sword, he'll get given everything and train. Another thing that he added was cohesion and loyalty, shifted from the state to the general, creating a professional force capable of fighting long campaigns far from home. So with these reforms, Marius trained a lean, disciplined, and motivated army. Over several campaigns, he defeated the Teutons at Aquae Sextae and at the Cimbri at Vercellae, slaughtering tens of thousands of enemy warriors. The victories were celebrated as miraculous, cementing his reputation as Rome's savior in a time of existential threat. Yet his methods also carried consequences. By binding soldiers to him personally and repeatedly taking command of armies, Marius showed that the true power in Rome now rested with the general, not the Senate. The old aristocracy, already wary of his populist tendencies, grew increasingly uneasy. Meanwhile, his army, fiercely loyal and battle-hardened, was now a political force in its own right. These years of triumph set the stage for one of the Republic's most consequential rivalries. So one of the, literally, like, I'd say one of the biggest rivalries in history. Like, it's huge. Not just Rome, but now we're about to introduce our second character. So let me repeat this paragraph again. These years of triumph set the stage for one of the Republic's most consequential rivalries. Across the social divide, a young noble named Lucius Cornelius Sulla watched Marius's rise with suspicion and resentment. Where Marius wielded popular support and military skill, Sulla represented the aristocratic ideal: discipline, ruthlessness, and devotion to tradition. The clash between them, fueled by ambition, ideology, and the loyalty of armies, would soon plunge Rome into civil war. Even after defeating the Cimbrian Teutons, Marius was far from finished. His repeated consulships had already stretched Roman tradition to the breaking point. By this time, he was no longer the vigorous young general who had captured Jugurtha and Numidia. He was older, battle-worn, and physically weakened. But his reputation and influence had never been stronger. Rome's crises demanded leaders, and Marius was determined that he would answer the call, even if the Senate resisted. The next threat came from the east. King Mithridates of Pontus, who threatened Rome's provinces with rebellion and conquest. Command of the campaign had been promised to Sulla, a brilliant young patrician general and former subordinate of Marius, who had captured Jugurtha alongside him years before. Sulla, loyal to tradition in the Senate, expected the assignment as his right. Marius, however, turned to the people, appealing directly to the assemblies and the tribunes. He framed himself not as a man seeking glory, but as Rome's only hope, reminding citizens of his victories, his service, and the stakes of the crisis. Through popular support and the loyalty of his veterans, Marius forced the vote, securing the command despite his age and the Senate's objections. Sulla could not accept the outcome. In a move that would shock Rome for generations, he marched his army on Rome in 88 BC, the first time in history that a Roman general had brought troops into the city itself, violating sacred law and long-standing taboo. Soldiers filled the streets, senators fled, and political violence erupted. Marius was forced to flee the city, escaping with his allies and supporters. Sulla then assumed control, sending forces east to confront Mithridates and establishing that a general with an army could dictate politics in Rome itself. While Sulla campaigned abroad, Marius saw an opportunity. He returned to Rome with allies, including the tribune Cinna, and seized control of Rome in 87 BC. This marked the second march on Rome, this time by Marius and his supporters, reversing Sulla's gains. Marius and Cinna used political purges and terror, targeting enemies of their faction. Proscriptions were employed on a limited scale, marking senators, equestrians, and political opponents for death or exile, with their property confiscated to reward supporters. Rome had now seen firsthand that political victory could be enforced through armies and violence. Even before these clashes, Marius had reshaped the military itself, which we had gone over earlier, with the Marian reforms. By the time of the Mithridatic dispute, Marius was old, worn by decades of campaigning and political battles, yet he remained a master of public perception. He appealed to the people as Rome's savior, securing command that the Senate and even Sulla had expected to control. His victories and political maneuvering highlighted a new reality. Armies were now instruments of personal power, and popular support could bend law and tradition to one man's will. The aftermath of these events permanently changed Rome. Marius died shortly after his 7th consulship in 86 BC, leaving the city in the hands of Sulla and the chaos he had helped unleash. So Marius actually died while in the city, in control of it, being elected the 7th consul, while Sulla was still in the east fighting Mithridates. So he's kind of just chilling in the city, and he's like an old guy. he's like, oh, I became consul again for the 7th time. And then he just dies and leaves all of his, allies and everyone to deal with Sulla. So Sulla actually returns from the east after Marius passes away. And so Sulla returned from the east in 83 BC to reclaim control, initiating a second civil war. This time, the prescriptions were employed on a massive scale. So Sulla employed the same prescriptions that Marius and Cinna did on a massive scale. So they only included a few people. Sulla's doing thousands, taking their property, killing them, whatever. It's a scary time. Everyone's scared. They're like, is my name going to be on there? You have to be good with Sulla, So this time the prescriptions were employed on a massive scale, publicly listing hundreds of enemies for execution and confiscating their property to reward followers. A really funny story to this is actually one of the people that he proscripts and is told to, writes his name down to be killed, is a young man named Gaius Julius Caesar, who obviously Sulla does not like, because he's kind of the heir to Gaius Marius. That's where he gets the name Gaius from. His great aunt Julia is Gaius Marius's wife, so they're related. And Sulla doesn't like that, so Sulla essentially wants to kill Caesar, and it's only through, I think, Marius's wife, Julius Caesar's aunt, that Julius Caesar is spared, because Sulla respects her, and she pleads with him to spare his life, but he even says, he's like, I'll spare his life, but I see many of Marius in that man. So this kind of ties into everything, because Julius Caesar, at the time of Sulla marching on Rome the second time and taking over dictatorship, is a young man. So Sulla was terrorizing the city, and it's important to note that the terror was deliberate. Opposition to the general was deadly, and the Republic itself had little power to intervene. Sulla eventually installed himself as dictator, formally demonstrating that military might could override law and senatorial authority. Through these events, Marius and Sulla had permanently transformed Rome. Backtrack real quick. I just want to say something about Sulla before we get into this. So Sulla did install himself as dictator, but I just feel that it's important to note he also reversed all of Marius's reforms. So all the stuff that let Marius become consul from a novus homo and stuff, that's all. He basically made it to where under Marius, the populares were in charge. The people, the poor people, everything. Like he passed a lot of laws for him. Under Sulla, it's back in the hands of the Senate. So because Sulla becomes dictator, he decides to kind of mold Rome in his image that he thinks will be the perfect Rome, which is with the Senate in control and the people kept in check and everything. So he installed himself as dictator, but then once he, had set up Rome in a way he felt was good, he actually retired. He retired and worked on a farm till he died. So it's kind of like he's a really interesting guy, when you think about it. Like he took over Rome in the same way Julius Caesar did, but he actually retired and was like, actually, I give it up. I did all I had to do. I set up Rome back in a way where I feel like it's good. Good job, me. Let me just retire. So I just had to say that real quick, that even though he did become dictator, it wasn't for life. He didn't rule Rome for the rest of his ages. He kind of reestablished Rome, put it back together, right? Like Marius was taken apart. Oh, I'm going to be consul this, I'm going to be consul this. He, in his mind, put it back together. He's like, all right, now we're back in Republic again. That is why, even though all of these events happened where it looks like it's falling apart, Julius Caesar was still born into the Roman Republic, right? It's just after Sulla. And that, I feel like that's kind of what we're tying in here. That's what I want you guys to understand is the Rome that Julius Caesar and Augustus are born into, and Augustus even more so because Julius Caesar does more to, stabilize Rome and stuff. But it's already been destabilized. Like Julius Caesar's not the guy doing the destabilizing, neither is Augustus. And in some ways, neither are Marius and Sulla, right? But that's where I feel like it kind of originates from in the beginning. Like if you really want to pinpoint a time where, okay, this is where the cracks start to show, this is where Rome starts to go from republic to empire, it's with these guys. And then this is the start and it finishes with Augustus. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with doing, the episode on these two and then Julius Caesar and then Augustus. So back to the narrative. Through these events, Marius and Sulla had permanently transformed Rome. Marius showed that popular support and personal loyalty could challenge the Senate, while Sulla proved that armies could enforce political will within the city itself. Civil war, once unthinkable, had become a reality. The Republic's institutions remained in form, but were hollowed out in practice. Generals with armies now held the real power, and political ambition had become inseparable from military force. From this crucible, the next generation of Roman leaders, Julius Caesar, Pompey, and ultimately Augustus, would inherit a republic already reshaped by ambition, violence, and military loyalty. Marius and Sulla had taught Rome a lesson that would echo for decades. In a republic stretched by empire, law, and tradition, could no longer restrain men who commanded armies, and the rules had changed forever. Hello, I just want to say thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Augustus podcast. It's part of a broader series called Great Important People of History. I haven't decided on the exact title. I think it's Great Figures of History. I think I'll go with that. But I just want to say thank you so much for listening. I'm going to be trying harder to, make this sound more professional and maybe get some better equipment and everything. And the next episode will be on Julius Caesar and his life and everything he did and his contributions to how he, destabilized Rome himself. But yeah, just thank you so much. I appreciate you, and I'll see you next time.